That morning, I woke up expecting the crisp bite of winter air, the rich scent of fresh pine drifting in from outside, and the satisfaction of spending the day building a roaring fire in my living room. Instead, I was greeted by an empty space, completely bare, where my neatly stacked firewood had stood just the night before. At first, I froze, my brain scrambling for an explanation. Had I miscalculated? Maybe I had used more wood than I thought? But no. Just yesterday, I had spent an entire hour stacking it meticulously, making sure it was dry, ready, and perfectly arranged for the season. Now it was simply gone. Not a single log remained. Someone had taken it, and they hadn't just grabbed a couple pieces in passing. No, they had wiped out my entire supply, down to the last splinter. The frustration hit me first, but it quickly twisted into something darker: suspicion. Who on earth would steal firewood? It was exactly a hot commodity. Pun intended. Jaw clenched. I stomped back inside and immediately pulled up the footage from my security camera. If some rogue raccoon had suddenly developed a taste for firewood, I wanted to see it for myself. But what appeared on the screen was far worse than anything I could have imagined. There she was, Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, the woman who took it upon herself to control every inch of our neighborhood, as if she were some kind of suburban dictator. And she wasn't even trying to be sneaky. With that ever-present smug expression plastered on her face, she strutted right up to my firewood pile in broad daylight. As if she were royalty overseeing her loyal subjects, she barked out orders to some poor, clueless neighbor who just happened to cross her path at the wrong time. Then, with a grand, almost theatrical wave of her hand, she motioned for 2 hired movers. Yes, actual movers, to load my firewood into the back of a pickup truck. She didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. Not once did she even glance around to see if anyone was watching. She simply took it. A mix of disbelief and fury burned through me. No note, no warning, no explanation. She had just decided, on her own, without so much as a courtesy knock, that my firewood now belonged to the HOA. And the worst part? I already knew exactly how she would justify it. Oh! She'd claim it was a violation of some ridiculous HOA guideline. Maybe she'd say my firewood wasn't aesthetically pleasing enough for her absurdly high standards. Or perhaps she'd insist it was a fire hazard. Never mind the fact that half the neighborhood had the exact same setup. But none of that mattered. Karen made the rules, and Karen decided when and how to break them. Fueled by pure indignation, I stormed down the street, straight to her house. Of course. She had turned her home into what looked like the official HOA headquarters, complete with an excessive display of American flags and a mailbox so perfectly pristine it could have been polished that very morning. I barely had a knock before she swung open the door, already looking irritated, almost as if she had expected me and considered my visit an inconvenience. Before I could even get a word in, she plastered on her fake customer service smile. "Oh, Jake, good morning. What a surprise. What can I do for you?" I crossed my arms, refusing to let her play innocent. "You can start by explaining why you stole my firewood." She had the audacity to scoff. "Stole? Jake, that's a rather strong word, don't you think? I merely repurposed it, for the good of the community." I narrowed my eyes. Repurposed? Karen, that was my firewood. I paid for it. I stacked it, and now it's gone. She tilted her head, speaking to me like I was a child too slow to understand. "Jake, you know as well as I do that the HOA has standards. Your firewood was unsightly, stacked a way that, frankly, did not match the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. I was doing you a favor by removing it." I gritted my teeth. "Karen, it was stacked in my backyard. Nobody could even see it." She waved a dismissive hand. "That's not the point. The HOA's annual bonfire is coming up, and we needed extra firewood. Your pile was the closest and most convenient." I let out a humorless laugh. "So, you're telling me you just help yourself to my firewood because it was convenient?" Karen sighed dramatically, already bore the conversation. "Oh, Jake, it's just firewood. I don't see why you're making such a fuss. You can always get more." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. Karen had a way of making everyone feel like they were the irrational ones, twisting the situation until their rightful anger seemed unjustified. But I wasn't falling for it. Not this time. Fine, I said, stepping back. Enjoy my firewood, Karen. But just know you've made a huge mistake. She laughed condescendingly. Oh, Jake, you're always so dramatic. It's just firewood. I turned and walked away, already forming my next move in my mind. Karen had ruled this neighborhood like her own personal kingdom for too long. But this time, she had crossed the wrong person. She had taken from me, not just out of greed, but out of sheer entitlement, believing she would never face any consequences. Well, that was about to change. I went straight to my garage, an idea so brilliantly devious forming in my mind that I almost laughed out loud. If Karen thought she could take whatever she wanted, whenever she wanted, then I would make sure she got exactly what she deserved. My hands worked quickly as I dug through my supplies, pulling out the perfect components for my plan. A few hollowed-out logs, a bag of fire ants, tiny creatures with a bite sharp enough to bring even the toughest person to tears, and just enough patience to wait for the perfect moment. Karen had unknowingly declared war, and I was more than ready to strike back. The neighborhood gathered at the HOA's annual bonfire event, an occasion meant to foster camaraderie, but one that had increasingly become a stage for Karen's self-importance. As expected, she stood front and center, basking in the attention of the residents. Microphone in hand, her voice rang through the crowd as she droned on about bringing the community together, making great sacrifices and single-handedly ensuring the event's success. She soaked up the admiration like a sponge, unaware that her moment of triumph was about to transform into a scene of utter humiliation. The fire pit crackled with warmth as people sipped hot cider and chatted. Karen, always eager to command the spotlight, insisted on the honor of tossing the first log into the flames. With a dramatic flair, she hoisted a hollowed-out log above her head as if making some grand ceremonial offering, then dropped it into the fire with exaggerated flourish. The crowd cheered as it caught flame, glowing brilliantly. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. Then the ants woke up. At first, just a few emerged, tiny, confused creatures, scurrying from a heat. But within seconds, it became an absolute swarm. Dozens turned to hundreds, then thousands, all fleeing inferno in pure survival mode. The fire pit became an explosion of chaos as the insects poured out in every direction, landing on shoes, crawling up legs, and biting anything in their path. Screams started small but escalated into a full-blown panic as the infestation took hold. Karen, standing closest to the fire, became the first and worst victim. A piercing shriek tore from her lips as she flailed wildly, desperately trying to swat away the ants that had invaded her sleeves, her back, her hair. She stumbled backward, crashing into the refreshments table. A massive bowl of cider tipped over, drenching her from head to toe just as the ants found their way beneath her clothes. The scene spiraled into pure pandemonium. People jumped from their seats, knocking over chairs and tables in their rush to escape the growing wave of ants. Someone tripped, sending a plate of marshmallows flying directly onto Karen's cider-soaked clothes. The sticky mess turned her into a walking glue trap for the frenzied insects. She spun in circles, shrieking about fire hazards and bioterrorism, while the entire neighborhood watched in horror-struck fascination. The HOA vice president, an elderly woman named Barbara, was the first to regain composure. "Somebody help her," she shouted, but no one was brave enough to get close. Still flailing, Karen tripped over a fallen chair and landed face first into the remnants of the marshmallow station. When she sat up, her face was plastered with melted sugar, her hair a tangled, sugary mess crawling with fire ants. The sight was so absurd, so utterly surreal, that I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. Karen, realizing she was getting no immediate help, made the only decision she could. She ran, sprinting past the crowd, through the park, and straight toward the lake at the edge of the event space. With an unceremonious splash, she threw herself into the water. Moments later, she emerged, gasping and flailing, her perfectly styled hair now dripping over her face like a defeated sea monster. The neighborhood stood frozen, watching in stunned silence. Then, the first chuckle rippled through the crowd. It spread, growing louder until the entire gathering was shaking with laughter. Even Barbara, still clutching her clipboard, was doubled over, tears streaming down her face. Karen, humiliated beyond belief, crawled out of the lake, her once perfect image in absolute ruins. She stomped toward her car, drenched, covered in marshmallow, her pride shattered. Without a word, she climbed inside, slammed the door, and drove off into the darkness, leaving behind a bonfire event that would be talked about for years to come. I lingered near the back of the crowd, sipping my cider, relishing every second. Karen had finally faced the consequences of her entitlement. And the best part? She had done it to herself. As I turned to leave, a few neighbors caught my eye, smirking knowingly. They didn't say a word, but their looks said it all. They knew. They knew I had something to do with this. But none of them would ever say a thing. The next morning, the aftermath of the bonfire disaster spread like wildfire. By the time I woke up, the entire street buzzed with whispers, texts flying back and forth. Neighbors were still chuckling over Karen's marshmallow and fire ant meltdown. The story evolved with each retelling. Some claimed her scream startled every dog within a 5-mile radius. Others swore she swallowed a marshmallow whole while flailing and nearly choked. But Karen herself? Nowhere to be seen. Her house, usually a hub of self-important activity, stood eerily quiet. No passive-aggressive HOA notices taped to doors. No condescending emails about trash bins. It was as if the queen had abandoned her throne. I figured she was licking her wounds, plotting her next move, trying to spin the story so she wasn't the villain. That was Karen's way. Never admit defeat, never back down. By the afternoon, her damage control began. An email titled Urgent. HOA meeting. Attendance mandatory. It was predictably dramatic, packed with phrases like gross misconduct, serious safety violations, and threats to neighborhood stability. She was going to frame herself as the victim. The meeting room was packed. Karen, already seated at the front, looked disheveled. Gone was her usual polished composure. Her frizzy hair and tight-lipped frustration betrayed her. She cleared her throat, forcing a sharp tone of authority. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. We have a very serious issue to address. Last night's bonfire was a disgrace, an act of deliberate sabotage against me personally. Chuckles rippled through the room. Karen's eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on me a second too long. Someone intentionally tampered with the firewood. This was an attack on our way of life, and I demand accountability. Silence. Then someone snickered. Barbara leaned forward. Karen, before we start throwing around accusations, shouldn't we discuss how the firewood got there? Karen stiffened. What do you mean? Barbara clasped her hands. Didn't you take that firewood from Jake's property? Without permission? A murmur spread through the room. Karen twitched. It was for the benefit of the community. Barbara raised an eyebrow. You mean the aesthetic standards that don't actually exist in the HOA guidelines? Karen floundered. Then old Mr. Thompson chuckled. Karen, you stole firewood, tossed it into the bonfire, and now you're mad because it backfired? Laughter erupted. Karen's face turned crimson. Barbara stood. I move for a vote to remove Karen as HOA president. Hands shot up. More than half. More than enough. Karen gasped. You need me. This community needs me. But no one was listening. She let out an inhuman screech and stormed out. The moment the doors slammed behind her, the room erupted into cheers. That night, I sat on my porch, a fresh pile of legally owned firewood beside me, sipping cider. The air was crisp, the stars twinkling. The HOA was free, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood actually felt like a community again. I raised my cup, smiling. Here's to justice. And for once, I could enjoy the fire in peace.